The steel door slammed shut behind Marcus Hill with a boom so loud it shook the floor under his feet. It was January 14th, 2015, the coldest week of the year in Florence, Colorado, and Marcus had just been locked inside a 7x12 concrete box with nothing but a cement bed, a steel toilet, and a slit of a window aimed at the sky so he could never see the horizon. For the last 23 hours, he hadn't spoken to a single person. Not an officer, not another prisoner, not even a voice through the door. Just silence so thick he could hear his own heartbeat bouncing off the concrete. Then it happened, the moment every ADX prisoner fears. A shadow moved behind the steel door's glass slot. Normally that meant a guard checking his pulse, his psych state, or making sure he wasn't trying to harm himself. But this time, the shadow didn't move on. It stayed, watching, waiting. Marcus stepped back. Every ADX inmate knew what this meant. A code cell inspection, the type they only did when they thought someone was breaking. The bolt clicked. The door cracked open. 4 officers in riot-style gear stood outside, shields up, helmets down. They weren't yelling. They weren't moving fast. They were silent, and that silence meant something far worse than shouting. Marcus' breath froze in the air as a lead officer quietly said, "Inmate Hill, step forward. Show us your hands." But Marcus didn't move, because he knew something the officers didn't. Something hidden inside his cell. Something no one was supposed to know he had. And now, the officers were seconds away from finding it. Cut to black. How did a prisoner locked in a concrete box for 23 hours a day manage to hide anything at all? And what exactly did he have that made ADX officials send in a fully armored extraction team? To understand what happened inside that cell, and how Marcus learned to survive inside a place designed to break the strongest men, we need to go back to the beginning. When Marcus Hill first arrived at ADX Florence on April 8, 2013, he didn't understand what he had truly walked into. He thought it was just another prison, harder, stricter, maybe colder, but still a prison. What he didn't know was that ADX wasn't built to punish behavior. It was built to control the human mind. His first moments on the property felt like he was stepping onto another planet. The road leading to the prison stretched through a silent desert plain, with Pikes Peak towering in the distance, its snow-covered top glowing under the Colorado sun. But nothing about the landscape felt alive. Even the wind moved in a straight, sharp line, as if it knew better than to linger near the most secure prison in the United States. Inside the receiving area, officers moved with clock-like precision, not rushed, not slow, just efficient. He was stripped, searched, scanned, given new clothing, and escorted through a series of metal-lined hallways that seemed intentionally designed to echo his footsteps back at him. Every sound reminded him that nothing he did here would go unnoticed. Finally, they stopped at a door marked C unit, part of a control unit, the section where inmates lived in near-total isolation. Marcus had heard rumors about it. Men whispered that this was where the Bureau of Prisons sent inmates they wanted to disappear without ever admitting it. No fights, no noise, no recreation yards full of shouting. Just silence, day after day, until time stopped meaning anything. The officer beside him tapped a code into the keypad. The thick steel door slid open with a mechanical hum. "Step in," the officer said. Marcus did. The first thing he noticed was a size 7 feet wide, 12 feet long. A small concrete box with a concrete bed, concrete desk, and concrete stool. The only metal was a toilet sink combo in the corner and the steel door behind him. The second thing he noticed was the window, a thin 4-inch wide slit aiming upward. Not outward, upward. It didn't show mountains or sky or trees. All he could see was a slice of blue, cut so narrow it looked like the world had been edited. He wouldn't see a single human face without permission. He wouldn't touch another human being unless it was during restraints. And he wouldn't hear another inmate unless someone screamed loud enough to travel through inches of concrete. "Lights on at 5 a.m., the officer said calmly. "Tray slot at 6:30. Rec 3 times a week if you're compliant. Don't cover your window. Don't cover your camera. Any issues, use the intercom." Marcus nodded, but his mind was stuck on the word recording he'd heard about ADX recreation. In regular prisons, rec meant basketball courts, yard time, weight piles, or at least fresh air. But at ADX, rec meant another small concrete box. This one with a mesh ceiling, where a man could pace in circles for an hour like a zoo animal trying to remember what freedom smelled like. The officer continued, "You'll get a handbook. Read it. Follow it. That's how you survive here." The door slammed shut behind him. For a few seconds, Marcus stood in the middle of the cell without moving. He didn't want to step forward. He didn't want to step back. The silence was too sharp, too thick. He hadn't realized silence could feel like a physical weight pressing down onto his shoulders. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. ADX cells had clocks, but they were intentionally small, and the sameness of each hour made time blur. Marcus eventually sat on the concrete bed, running his fingers along the rough surface. He thought about the men ADX had housed before him, people like Ted Kaczynski, Ramsey Youssef, Richard Reed, and members of major organized crime and gang networks. He wasn't in a prison with those men. He was in the same system built to contain them. On his second day, Marcus received his first meal, a tray pushed through the narrow slot. No voice, no eye contact, just a hand sliding metal across metal. The food was bland, portioned, and packed in small containers that made every meal feel like a countdown. Finished or not, the tray disappeared exactly 10 minutes later. After 3 days, Marcus realized something most ADX inmates eventually learn. Silence isn't the hardest part. Loneliness is. It plays tricks on you. It makes every sound amplified. The hum of a vent becomes a knock. A loose bolt in the door becomes a voice. A cough 2 cells away becomes a conversation in your head. He found himself pacing the length of the cell over and over again, 7 feet forward, 7 feet back, until he could have walked the distance with his eyes closed. But then came the moment that changed everything. During one of his pacing sessions, Marcus noticed a tiny imperfection in the wall near the bed, a small chip in concrete. It wasn't big, it wasn't deep, but in a place where every inch was monitored, controlled, and polished, this flaw felt like a secret, a hidden detail that didn't belong, something the prison had missed. And in ADX, anything the prison misses becomes power. Marcus reached out and pressed his fingertip against the chip. It moved, not much, maybe a millimeter, but enough to tell him the concrete didn't end where it should have. Something was behind it. He froze. Because if ADX officers ever found him touching that wall, if they ever suspected he was hiding something, if they ever thought he was discovering something, they would storm his cell without hesitation. Still, Marcus slid his hand across the wall again, slower this time, pretending to stretch. The floor shifted again. He didn't know what was behind it. He didn't know if it was safe. But he knew, without a doubt, that this tiny hidden space was the only piece of the prison he controlled. The only piece ADX didn't own. That realization electrified him. It gave him focus. It gave him purpose. It gave him a secret. And in ADX, a secret can keep a man alive. But secrets also attract attention. And just 3 weeks later, on January 14, 2015, officers outside his cell noticed something on their monitors. Something unusual. Something that made them send a 4-man team to his door. Something that led to the moment we saw in The Hook, when the door creaked open, when the shadows leaned in, and when Marcus stood face to face with the officers who were about to discover everything he'd been hiding. Marcus didn't sleep the night before the officers showed up at his door. Sleep inside ADX never came naturally. It came in short bursts, quick moments when his eyes closed out of exhaustion, not comfort. The lights never fully turned off in his cell. They dimmed, yes, but the faint glow was always there, humming in the corner of his vision, reminding him that even in darkness, someone was watching. He had learned by his second month that privacy was something ADX Florence didn't believe in. A camera sat in the top corner of his cell, small enough to blend into the concrete, angled down toward him like an unblinking eye. Marcus knew the reality. Officers could watch him at any time, day or night, and on some shifts, they watched him more than others. But what happened during the first week of January 2015 was different. He could feel it before he could explain it. Everything inside the prison felt tighter. Officers walked faster. They spoke less. Even the sound of keys jingling outside the pod seemed more frequent, like they were running checks on someone who had triggered alarms one too many times. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the flaw in the concrete wall wasn't just a flaw. Something behind that wall was interfering with the prison's sensors. And ADX Florence didn't tolerate interference. It began on the morning of January 9th. Marcus woke up to the metallic clang of a meal tray sliding through the slot. He reached down to grab it, but just as he touched the tray, he noticed something odd. The officer didn't walk away. Marcus froze. Officers never lingered during tray delivery. At ADX, the entire process was about speed and control. Slide tray, lock slot, move on. But this officer stood still. Marcus didn't look up. Inmates at ADX learned fast that eye contact during feeding time made officers suspicious. He kept his eyes on the tray, pretending to study the bland oatmeal. The officer finally stepped away. Marcus sat back and listened to the footsteps as they moved down the range in a steady rhythm. But the moment the footsteps reached the end of the hall, they stopped again. That was the second warning sign. Officers only paused at the end of the tier when something wasn't right, when a report, a monitor, or a sudden alert told them to slow everything down. Over the next few days, Marcus heard unusual noises through the walls at night. The soft thump of boots, the static crackle of radios, short bursts of whispered communication. ADX was usually methodical, predictable, controlled. But something during that week was out of rhythm. On January 12th, at around 8:40 p.m., Marcus was lying on the concrete bed staring at the ceiling when he heard a faint tapping behind the wall, the same wall where he'd found the tiny concrete chip months earlier. Tap. Silence. Tap, tap. His heartbeat quickened. He sat up slowly, not wanting his movement to look suspicious if the camera was focused on him. He placed his palm flat on the wall the way he had done dozens of times before. Then, he pressed gently upward at the exact spot where the imperfection had shifted. This time, it moved more than it ever had, maybe half an inch. And beneath the chipped concrete, he felt something foreign, something that wasn't stone or cement. It felt metallic, thin, flat, smooth. His stomach tightened. Smuggling contraband into ADX Florence was nearly impossible. Anything found in the walls wasn't put there by inmates. It was part of the building itself, part of the infrastructure. And the only things behind those concrete layers were wiring conduits, ventilation pockets, and pressure sensors. He traced the object again, and a cold realization hit him. He wasn't touching something someone hid. He was touching something someone forgot to remove. A thin maintenance plate, a sliver of forgotten access material that, if pulled just right, could reveal a tiny cavity between the layers of the wall, a cavity too small to crawl into, too narrow to use as a hiding spot, but just big enough for a strip of wiring or broken plastic to fall inside. Broken plastic. Sensors. Alarms. Marcus jerked his hand away from the wall, because he knew now why the officers had been lingering, why the radios crackled late at night, why the tray delivery officer paused at his slot. The prison thought someone was tampering with the sensors, and if the record showed unusual readings near C Unit, Cell 214, they would assume the only person responsible was a man living in that cell. Marcus spent hours at night lying awake, staring at the dim ceiling light. He didn't sleep. He barely blinked. He kept replaying the same question in his mind. If they check the wall, will they think I did this on purpose? At ADX, intent didn't matter. Even suspicion could get a prisoner placed in more severe restrictions, special restraints, psychological evaluations, or even a complete removal of outside communication. If the Bureau of Prisons believed he was a security threat, he could lose everything he had left, his books, his mail, his limited recreation. By sunrise on January 13th, Marcus had decided to leave the wall alone. Don't touch it. Don't look at it. Don't do anything that would draw a single extra blink from the camera in the ceiling. But it was too late. That afternoon, around 3:17 p.m., Marcus heard fast footsteps approaching his door. Heavy boots, synchronized, moving with purpose. He sat up straight, heart pounding. Then came the sound that froze every man inside the facility. The magnetic lock on the outer security door disengaged. It was a deep, electric hum, the sound ADX inmates rarely heard unless something serious was happening. This was not a meal slot check, not a routine head count, not a medical round. This sound meant only one thing. A team was entering the tier. Marcus listened as the boots moved closer and closer, echoing through the long hallway. 1 pair, 2 pairs, 3 pairs, then silence. They were standing outside his door. He knew they were watching him through the tiny reinforced glass panel. Even without looking directly at the door, Marcus felt their tension sink through the metal-like weight on his chest. Seconds stretched. Minutes passed. Then nothing. No words. No commands. No alarms. Eventually, the footsteps retreated. Marcus exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. But he didn't know the truth. The officers weren't coming to inspect him that day. They were observing him, monitoring his movements, studying his behavior to decide whether they needed to enter the cell with a code cell extraction. Inside ADX, they never storm in without watching first. They plan. They calculate. They wait until the moment a prisoner makes even the slightest mistake. And Marcus had made one. In the early morning hours of January 14th, 2015, a shift supervisor reviewed the sensor logs for the third time. Something near Marcus' wall had triggered minor fluctuations, tiny ones, but enough to alert the system again. Enough to make the supervisor say the words that changed everything. Prep the inspection team. We're clearing cell 214 first round. And so, at 7:42 a.m., the moment the hook began, Marcus stood frozen inside his concrete box, staring at four officers in full extraction gear as they cracked his door open. Shields up, visors down, voices muted. The lead officer repeated, "Inmate Hill, step forward. Show us your hands." But Marcus didn't move, because behind him, hidden in that tiny flaw in the wall, was the key to everything that came next. The moment Marcus froze in front of the four-man extraction team, the temperature inside the cell felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the cold Colorado air leaking in through the cracked door. But Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he moved the wrong way, everything could escalate. ADX Florence extraction teams didn't come in loudly. They came in like surgeons, controlled, deliberate, and precise. Their goal wasn't to hurt inmates. It was to neutralize any threat before the inmate even understood what was happening. Every step had been practiced hundreds of times. Every position had a purpose. Every movement had rules. The lead officer took a single step forward, raising his shield just enough to cover his torso. His visor reflected the dim cell light, giving Marcus a view of his own face, pale, tense, and trapped. "Show us your hands," the officer repeated, each word slow and clear. Marcus finally lifted his hands, palms open. He understood that hesitation meant danger. Resistance meant higher-level restraints. And silence meant they would assume he was hiding something. But Marcus wasn't ready for what came next. As soon as his hands reached chest height, the officers didn't move forward. Instead, the lead officer signaled to someone outside the frame. A female voice called out from the hallway, "Camera on. Begin recording. Log time, 7:42 a.m. That sentence hit harder than the shields. Every major operation inside ADX was recorded for accountability and documentation. But when a specific phrase like "begin recording" echoed down the tier, it meant this wasn't a random check. It meant an incident report had already been started. It meant someone believed something serious was happening in cell 214. The officer stepped inside, shield first, followed by another officer holding a small metal container. It looked harmless, simple, silver, routine. But Marcus knew exactly what it was. A handheld ion scanner. These devices detect microscopic particles, traces of contraband, explosive materials, or substances that shouldn't be anywhere inside ADX. The officers weren't here to search Marcus. They weren't even here for the bed or the desk. They were here for the wall. "Turn around," the officer said. Marcus obeyed. "Hands behind your back." Click, click. Handcuffs locked around his wrists. Two officers guided him toward the center of the cell. Their grips weren't violent, just firm, practiced, unbreakable. The third officer stepped past Marcus and ran the ion scanner along the cell wall. Beep, silence. Beep, silence. Then the scanner reached the small imperfection Marcus had found months earlier. For a moment, the scanner didn't react. Then, beep, 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 beep. A rapid, high-pitched alarm filled the cell. Every ADX officer stiffened. Marcus closed his eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. The hidden maintenance plate or wiring pocket, whatever it was, shouldn't have triggered a response like this. A normal fluctuation might cause a single beep. maybe two. But this was a direct hit. "What do you see?" The supervisor called from the hall. The scanning officer leaned closer. "Reading abnormal density. Possible cavity behind the panel." Marcus's heart pounded. He wasn't hiding anything. He didn't plant anything. He didn't tamper with anything. But in a place like ADX, innocence didn't matter. Suspicion was enough. "All right," the lead officer said. "Remove him." Marcus felt hands tighten around his arms. He was lifted slightly off his feet and guided backward toward the hallway. Not dragged, just moved with mechanical precision. Outside the cell, the hall felt colder and brighter, the overhead lights buzzing loudly. He heard the supervisor again. "Secure the inmate in holding. Open a maintenance ticket. We're checking that wall." Those words were worse than restraints. ADX maintenance checks weren't casual. They didn't walk in with tools and curiosity. They came with drills, hammers, and backup officers. And once they opened that cavity, they would inspect every inch, take photos, file reports, and assume the worst until proven otherwise. Marcus knew how this would look on paper. Inmate displayed defensive body language when extraction team approached. Inmate had unexplained fluctuations on cell sensors. Possible tampering with structural material. Even without evidence, that was enough to move him into special security measures or a deeper isolation program. But the moment they escorted him into a short, narrow hallway, Marcus realized something even worse. He wasn't the only one being watched. As the officers turned him toward the temporary holding cell, a small steel room used during inspections, Marcus caught a glimpse of another inmate across the range. A man with a shaved head, deep-set eyes, and hands cuffed behind his back. He stood perfectly still, staring directly at Marcus. He wasn't unfamiliar. Marcus recognized him immediately. Derek Stone Caldwell, a federal inmate with a history of manipulating prison systems, including electrical and structural weaknesses. Stone was known for listening, watching, studying guards. He wasn't violent in the traditional sense, but he was dangerous in a way ADX officers didn't like to talk about. He used information as a weapon. And now, he was watching Marcus with unsettling focus. The officers shoved Marcus gently into the holding cell and shut the door. The sound of the lock echoed through his bones. He stood in the small room, hands chained, cold air filling his lungs. He could hear movement down the hall, tools clinking, boots shifting, radios crackling. The maintenance team had entered his cell. They were opening the wall. Minutes passed, then 20, then 40. Finally, at around 8:25 a.m., the supervisor's voice echoed faintly down the tier. "Found it. Looks like leftover construction material. Old wiring plate. Nothing intentional." Marcus exhaled in relief, but then the supervisor added, "But it was loose, and loose material shouldn't be inside an active cell. That's a problem." That one sentence made Marcus's stomach drop again. If ADX staff believed the loose cavity created any kind of risk, they would assume the inmate in the cell might have disturbed it. "Check camera footage," the supervisor said. "See if he ever tampered with the wall." That's when Marcus felt the real fear. Because even if he had touched the wall innocently, even if it was for a second, even if it was curiosity and not tampering, the camera would show it. His pacing, his curiosity, his hand brushing the surface. And footage didn't show thoughts. It didn't explain context. It didn't show fear or boredom or loneliness. It only showed actions. A guard walked past the holding cell, glancing in through the slot, then continued down the hall. The sound of boots echoed again, followed by the metallic slam of a maintenance panel being reinstalled. Marcus stood completely still, because he realized the truth. They weren't checking whether he broke the wall. They were checking whether he was becoming a threat. And threats inside ADX didn't get warnings. They didn't get chances. They got deeper isolation. By the time officers returned to escort him back, Marcus knew that everything was about to change, not because of the wall, but because someone, somewhere in the prison logs, now believed Marcus might be testing the limits of his cell. And at ADX Florence, once they suspect you're testing limits, they start testing you. When the officers finally escorted Marcus back toward his cell, the hallway felt different, colder, wider, emptier. ADX Florence had a special way of making the same space feel like a different world depending on what you were going through. Earlier that morning, the tier felt like a battlefield. Now, it felt like a courtroom hallway where the verdict hadn't been announced yet, but was already decided. The two officers holding Marcus didn't speak. They kept him centered between them, hands cupped behind his back, elbows locked in place. Their steps were perfectly synchronized. Every few seconds, one officer glanced toward the glass panels lining the hall, the reinforced windows used for staff observation. Someone behind those panels was watching. Marcus didn't know who. It could have been a lieutenant, a captain, a psychologist, even the warden. At ADX, the higher-ups rarely showed themselves, but they always monitored. When they reached cell 214, Marcus expected to walk straight in. But he didn't. The officers stopped. Marcus looked up slightly, not fully, because making direct eye contact during an active incident could escalate things, but just enough to see what they were waiting for. A third officer approached, holding a small laptop-style device, not for writing reports. This was a body orifice scanner, a portable digital device the Bureau of Prisons used when they believed an inmate might have hidden something on their person during a disturbance. "Turn around," the officer said. Marcus obeyed. They scanned his ankles, his legs, his waist, his arms, even his hairline. A long beep sounded, clear, uninterrupted, no alerts. The officer nodded. Clear. For a moment, Marcus thought that meant he was going back into the cell as normal. But it didn't. The lead officer signaled to the tower officer controlling the doors. A loud mechanical buzz filled the hallway as the inner security door swung open, giving access to the cell. The officers looked inside first, slowly, thoroughly, their shields raised even though they knew the cell was empty. Then one officer stepped inside and stood against the far wall. They were placing themselves in a containment position. That meant they still considered Marcus a potential threat. "Bring him," the lead officer said. Only then did they walk him in. As soon as Marcus crossed the threshold, he felt the difference. The smell was sharper, the air colder. His bed had been flipped upward and pinned against the wall with a temporary metal brace. Sheets gone, toilet lid removed, desk wiped clean. Even the single bolted-down stool had been repositioned to the far corner. This wasn't a normal cell search. This was an intensive cell integrity check, a search protocol used after suspected tampering with infrastructure or surfaces. Every item, every surface, every angle had been photographed. Marcus stood silently as the officers uncuffed him. "Face the wall." He complied. As the door shut behind them, Marcus waited for the familiar metallic click of the locking mechanism. But instead, the door stayed open. Only an inch, just barely, almost invisible. But that inch meant something huge. It meant he wasn't cleared yet. Whenever ADX staff kept the door cracked after an operation, it meant they were still evaluating the inmate, watching how he moved, how he reacted, how he handled the first moments alone after an incident. Marcus stood motionless, staring at the bare wall in front of him, trying not to look tense. At ADX, even body language could be misinterpreted. Too stiff meant resistance. Too relaxed meant possible manipulation. Too still meant psychological distress. Too restless meant agitation. After what felt like 10 minutes, though it could have been 2, the magnetic lock finally engaged. The door clicked shut. Marcus exhaled slowly. He was alone again. But this time, it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like surveillance. He turned and scanned the room, noticing details he hadn't noticed before. A new scrape on the floor where the officers dragged the stool, a bit of dust in the corner where the maintenance team drilled, a faint chemical smell from the cleaning spray they used after intensive wall checks. The wall with the concrete floor had a small rectangle of fresh patchy material, light gray, smooth, slightly raised. They had sealed it. No more cavity, no more secret, no more control. Marcus sat on the concrete bed frame, staring at the patched section of the wall. He felt something close to panic, but not the kind most people imagine. It wasn't fear of being punished. It was fear of losing the only space he had influence over. Because in a place like ADX, control wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Prisoners who had no control broke faster. They became erratic. They lost their sense of time. They spiraled into paranoia. The Bureau of Prisons documented dozens of cases like that over the years. Inmates who deteriorated after extended isolation without anchors or routines. And that small crack, that tiny loose piece of concrete, it had been Marcus's anchor. Without it, the cell felt smaller. The silence felt louder. The hours felt longer. As the minutes crawled by, Marcus tried to settle his mind. He lay on the concrete bed frame, staring up at the ceiling. The dim light buzzed quietly, like it always did. The vent hummed every few seconds. The toilet pipe made a soft metallic ping. These noises were the heartbeat of the building, tiny reminders that the world was still moving outside the concrete walls. Then he heard something unusual. A soft, low sound, barely audible, almost like a whisper traveling through thick stone. Marcus sat up slowly. The sound came again. Not a voice, not words, just a rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. It was coming from the direction of the adjacent cell. Marcus moved closer to the wall, careful not to appear too intentional in case the camera would focus on him. He tilted his head, listening carefully. Tap, 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 tap. It was the same pattern he'd heard behind the maintenance cavity days earlier. But now the cavity was sealed, which meant someone, another inmate, was sending a signal. Marcus had never communicated with another ADX prisoner before. It was dangerous, forbidden, highly monitored, and yet he also knew something the officers didn't. When the maintenance team patched the cavity, they created a new vulnerability. Concrete drives from the outside in. The inner layer, the part touching the hollow pocket between the cell walls, would still be semi-soft. Soft enough for vibrations. Soft enough to transmit taps. Soft enough for someone to communicate through. Marcus leaned slightly closer, his heart racing as he listened again. This time the taps weren't random. They were deliberate, slow, patient. Someone on the other side was waiting for a response. Marcus hesitated. Communication between cells was one of the fastest ways to get written up, restricted, or placed under heightened observation. Officers took it seriously because inmates used tapping systems in the past to coordinate hunger strikes, pass-coded messages, or even time-disrupted behavior. But the silence in his cell was crushing him, and the taps, they felt like a lifeline. For the first time since arriving at ADX, Marcus lifted his hand. He placed 2 fingers gently on the wall, paused, then tapped twice. The response came immediately. Tap, tap, tap. 3 taps. Marcus's chest tightened. That was one of the oldest inmate-to-inmate signals in American prison culture. Not dangerous, not coded, not threatening. It simply meant. Marcus didn't move for nearly a full minute after the tapping stopped. In a place like ADX, even second could stretch into something longer, more elastic, more unreal. The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was thick, watchful, pressing. He could feel the building listening. He sat on the edge of the concrete bed frame, hands resting on his knees, breathing slow and steady. Not out of calm, but out of necessity. ADX rewarded stillness. Agitation, pacing, sudden movements, those drew attention. Those signaled instability, and instability triggered reports. Reports led to evaluations. Evaluations led to restrictions. He had already dealt with enough attention today. But the tapping, that changed things, because no prisoner in ADX Florence tapped on a wall without a purpose. Not here, not in this kind of isolation. Tapping wasn't communication. It was an invitation, a test, a message sent through concrete to see if the person on the other side was drowning or swimming. Marcus stared at the patched section of the wall. The gray was a different shade than the rest of the cell, lighter, smoother, fresh. It hadn't blended into the environment yet. And the fact that he had felt clear, sharp vibrations meant the cavity behind the concrete still had space inside, still had air, still had a path for sound to travel. Someone on the other side had figured that out too. Someone with experience. Someone who listened more than he spoke. He thought about the man he'd seen earlier, Derek Stone Caldwell, a long-term federal inmate known in the system for manipulating routines, timing guard movements, and studying the structure of prison buildings. Stone didn't communicate casually. He always had a reason. Marcus replayed Stone's stare in his mind, the way he stood silently, unblinking, watching Marcus being escorted down the hallway. That wasn't boredom. That was calculation, observation, recognition. If Stone was the one tapping, then Marcus had drawn the attention of someone who understood ADX better than most staff did. Hours passed. The light in his cell dimmed slightly as the day shifted into evening mode. Not darkness, just a lower level of artificial glow. The hum of the ventilation system continued in its steady rhythm. The building never truly slept. Then, at 6:17 p.m., the tray slot clanged open. Dinner. Marcus moved toward the slot, but the officer didn't slide the tray in right away. Instead, Marcus saw only the side of the officer's glove and the faint shadow of their arm. This wasn't normal. Meal exchanges at ADX were strictly timed and executed with near-military precision. Slot opens. Tray slides. Slot closes. Move on. Lingering meant something was off. Then the officer spoke, not loudly, but clearly. "Inmate Hill, you good?" Marcus froze. Guards at ADX rarely asked how an inmate was doing. They asked for compliance. They asked for positioning. They gave orders. They didn't check in. "Yes," Marcus replied carefully. "I'm fine." A pause. Then the tray slid in. "Eat up," the officer said. The slot slammed shut. Marcus stared at the metal tray, not hungry but alert. Something was changing. First the tapping. Now officers showing uncharacteristic concern. He picked at the meal. Bland vegetables, a scoop of beans, a small piece of cornbread, and placed the tray back near the slot when finished. Time passed quietly until the nighttime checks began. Footsteps approaching each cell, flashlights shining through windows and slots to confirm the inmate's condition. ADX ran checks like clockwork. 8 p.m., 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m., and 4 a.m. But the 10 p.m. check was different. The flashlight lingered on Marcus longer than usual. Instead of sweeping the room, the beam stayed focused on him, right on his face. "Move your hand," the officer said. Marcus complied, raising his hand slightly. The officer stared at him for another 5 seconds, then finally moved on. This wasn't routine observation. This was evaluation. He lay back on the concrete bed frame, eyes open. The adrenaline still hadn't faded. His thoughts drifted back to the tapping, the rhythm, the meaning, the sudden cutoff. Was Stone testing him, warning him, trying to make contact? Or was someone else involved? ADX Florence housed some of the most isolated and watched inmates in the United States. But even here, communication found cracks. Inmates made code from the scrape of metal on concrete. They learned the rhythm of footsteps to exchange messages. Some even used plumbing systems, tapping patterns that echoed faintly between sinks and pipes. Marcus didn't know which system this tapping came through, but he knew the message was intentional. Around midnight, another sound broke the darkness. A soft scrape, metal against metal, coming from the vent near the ceiling. Marcus sat up. He knew the normal vent noises by now. This wasn't one of them. The scrape repeated. Slow, careful, deliberate. He stared up at the vent. Someone was trying to get his attention. A whisper followed, faint, nearly swallowed by the ventilation system, barely traveling through the metal. "Keep quiet." Marcus's breath stopped. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't clear, but it was real, and it belonged to another inmate. It had to. Staff didn't whisper through vents at midnight. Then another sentence, broken by static. "Not alone, watching you." The hair on Marcus's arms rose. "Not alone, watching you." He leaned closer, trying to hear more, but the vent only hummed. The whisperer had said what he needed to say, nothing more. Marcus slid back onto the bed, pulse racing. Someone knew he had been inspected. Someone knew his cell was opened. Someone knew about the sensors. Someone knew he had responded to the tapping. And someone, likely someone who understood the building system, believed Marcus was being monitored more closely than usual. He thought again of Stone Coldwell. Stone had spent decades in federal custody. He had rotated through facilities from USP Lewisburg to USP Marion before being sent to ADX. He knew how to watch officers without being seen watching. He knew how to listen through walls. He knew how to sense tension before staff even realized they were exhibiting it. Was Stone warning him, or was Stone studying him? Marcus didn't know. But the next morning, he got his answer. At 7:05 a.m., breakfast arrived. The tray slid through as usual, but this time there were two things on the tray: a small carton of milk and a folded napkin. ADX never delivered napkins. Marcus looked around the cell instinctively, making sure no officer was watching too closely, then slowly lifted the napkin. Underneath it was a tiny triangular piece of cardboard, the corner of a food carton, torn off neatly. On it, scratched with something sharp, were 4 numbers: 214, 215. Marcus stared at them. His cell number, and the cell next to his. Stone's cell. The napkin had been placed on his tray intentionally, but the officers didn't deliver inmate-to-inmate messages, which meant the only way this could have arrived was through another inmate manipulating the tray distribution. That was nearly impossible, unless the inmate worked the food prep line at USP Florence, the medium-security prison next door, before the trays were trucked into the ADX facility. Some inmates at USP Florence were assigned to kitchen duty where they prepared meal components that ADX officers later distributed. If Stone had managed to get a signal to an inmate over there, someone willing to help him pass a message, then this wasn't improvisation. This was coordination. Marcus didn't touch the folded napkin again for nearly an hour. He sat on the concrete bed frame with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, letting the meaning of the message absorb into him slowly. ADX Florence wasn't the kind of place where you reacted quickly. Quick reactions got men written up, reclassified, or was noticed. At ADX, survival meant thinking like the building itself, slow, deliberate, controlled. Still, the numbers burned in his mind. 214, 215. Hill to Stone. Stone Caldwell didn't reach out to people. That was a part the Bureau of Prisons never fully understood about him. Stone wasn't a gang leader. He wasn't an aggressor. He wasn't a disruptor. He was an observer. He watched for years before acting. Decades, even. He had an uncanny ability to predict small changes around him, a cracked tile pattern, a shift in officer walking rhythm, a new echo in event. If Stone was initiating communication, it meant Marcus was part of something Stone had already been studying long before today. But what? Marcus lifted his head slowly, scanning his cell. The patch wall, the vent, the tiny streak of dust left behind from the maintenance drills, the repositioned stool. Everything had changed inside this cell in the last 24 hours. But one thing didn't change. Stone had noticed something before the staff did. Marcus replayed the last 3 days step by step. The wall, the cavity, the taps, the whisper in the vent, the extraction team, the officers lingering, the scanner, the patch job, the napkin. His pulse accelerated as the pieces connected in a way he hadn't seen before. The wall wasn't the trigger. Stone was. Stone had been watching long before Marcus ever touched that cavity. He must have sensed a structural irregularity in the wall months ago, maybe even years. But Stone couldn't access it himself. His cell was built differently. His section of the range wasn't exposed to the maintenance floor. But Marcus's was, which meant Stone didn't want the wall for communication. He wanted what was behind it. Marcus approached the patch section slowly, pretending to stretch, pretending to loosen his shoulders in a harmless, non-threatening way. He placed his fingertip on the smooth gray patch. It was harder now, no longer soft from a fresh compound, drying fast. If Marcus was going to understand what Stone wanted, he needed to get answers before the patch fully cured. But he couldn't scratch it. He couldn't pick at it. He couldn't do anything aggressive toward the wall. The camera was watching. Always. Marcus exhaled through his nose and sat back down. He needed another way, another angle, another signal. That's when he noticed it. A faint pencil-thin shadow on the floor near the wall, something he hadn't seen earlier. He leaned closer. It was dust. Fine, gray dust, the kind that falls when concrete is drilled or sanded. The maintenance team had vacuumed most of the debris, but they missed a corner behind the bed frame. Marcus looked at the tiny smear of dust on the floor, and that's when the realization hit him. The cavity behind the wall wasn't empty. Something was inside, something the maintenance crew didn't find, something that Stone believed Marcus had access to. Marcus wiped the dust with his finger and held it up to the light. It was so fine it almost disappeared on his skin. But there, barely visible, were 2 tiny specks of shiny material. Metallic. He froze. This wasn't concrete dust. It was wiring dust. Old wires, possibly copper, possibly from a long-abandoned communication system built into the ADX layout. Before the control unit was modernized, older wings of the prison used outdated electrical conduits that were abandoned during upgrades but never fully removed. Stone knew about those conduits. Marcus didn't, at least not until now. He sat back, heart racing. If there were old electrical lines behind that cavity, if they connected to older maintenance pathways, if Stone knew where they led, then the tapping wasn't communication. It was mapping. Stone was testing how far the vibrations traveled. He was measuring the hollow space behind the wall. He wasn't talking to Marcus. He was using Marcus as a sensor. Marcus closed his eyes. He'd been used. But the question was why? The answer arrived that afternoon. At 2:14 p.m., the ventilation system shifted, something Marcus had only experienced a handful of times. The airflow changed direction. Air pressure dropped slightly. Then the vents emitted a long, low hum. Not random. Long. Pause. Long. Pause. Short. Short. It was deliberate. Marcus sat up. His heart pounded. Stone wasn't tapping anymore. He was using the ventilation system itself. Marcus placed both palms on the wall. The hum vibrated through the concrete. Faint, controlled, intentional. Stone was asking him something. Not asking, telling. The hum repeated. Long. Pause. Long. Pause. Short. Short. Marcus swallowed hard as the pattern clicked into place. It was an old prison signal. One rarely used anymore, but recognizable to anyone who'd spent years navigating federal facilities. It meant, break soon. Marcus felt cold. Break what? Break how? Break where? He wasn't planning anything. He wasn't part of anything. He wasn't even sure he understood what Stone wanted. Then the hum changed again. Short, short, short. That was the signal Marcus feared most. It meant, watch now. Watch what? He stood still, listening for more, but the vent quieted. The hum stopped. The air pressure normalized. ADX returned to its usual dead quiet. Marcus looked around the cell again, eyes slowly scanning every corner. What was he supposed to be watching? The camera? The patch? The door? The floor? Nothing moved. Then his eyes drifted to the tiny slit window pointing upward at the Colorado sky, and he saw it. A faint shadow moving across the narrow blue slice. Too small to be a helicopter. Too steady to be a bird. Too quick to be a cloud. Something, or someone, was moving across the roofline. Marcus stepped back. Someone outside the building was coordinating with Stone. Stone wasn't warning Marcus anymore. He was activating him. And Marcus didn't know whether he was being protected or used as a piece in something much, much bigger.